Recording.
Class, I want everybody to take out a piece of paper and write on it different uses for peanuts that you could think of. Okay, we're going to do this for a few minutes. Rose, you can use your iPad, yes. Okay, a few minutes is up. I'd like some answers of what you wrote is a good use for peanuts. Jack, peanut butter. That's right. You could eat peanuts plain. That's true too. What else can you do with peanuts? Peanut oil. Very smart. Okay, so each of you have a whole list. I see. Very good job. You each have a list of different uses for peanuts. And when we read this book, it is going to tell us even more uses for peanuts than any of you could write up, have written down on your list. If anybody feels that they have more on their list than what's in the book, then you'll let me know when we get up to it, okay? So this book that we're going to read today is called A Picture Book of George Washington Carver. That man's name is George Washington Carver. The author is David A. Adler. The illustrator, who reminds me what the illustrator is? Very good. The person who drew all the pictures is Dan Brown. Okay. The reason we're reading this book today is who remembers that we learned last week about crop rotation? Excellent. Good job. Crop rotation, that in the South, they kept planting the same crop over and over. What crop was that? That was cotton, exactly. And it kept ruining the ground because the crops were destroying the ground, and they needed something called crop rotation to use different crops, and that helped give back the nutrients back to the soil. And in this book, it's going to tell us a little bit about crop rotation. I'll warn you before we get up to that point. It's also going to talk about peanuts, because that was one of the main crops that George Washington Carver discovered that helped with crop rotation. And we're going to be stopping at points to talk about what we're reading, so don't be surprised. And of course, I'll be walking up and down the row so everybody can see the pictures. Okay, we are ready to begin. A Picture Book of George Washington Carver. George Washington Carver was born a slave. He was never sure of his birth date, just that it was in 1864 or early 1865, near the end of the Civil War. He was born on the Missouri farm of Moses and Susan Carver, where his mother, Mary, was a slave. Who can remind me, what was the Civil War? Go ahead. That's right. And the Civil War was a fight over should we have slavery or not. So if George Washington Carver was after the Civil War, that means that already slaves are being freed. Slaves are beginning to, educate themselves. Right, exactly. Let's go on. George hardly knew his mother. When he was an infant, raiders kidnapped him and his mother and took them to Arkansas. A neighbor found George and brought him home, but he didn't find Mary. Young George Washington Carver never saw her again. George's father was a slave too, but George never met him. His father worked on a neighbor's farm and was killed in an accident around the time George was born. George and his brother James were raised by Moses and Susan Carver. The Carvers were good to the boys. George called Mr. Carver Uncle Moses. Who can remind me about a certain slave we just recently read about that was not treated this nicely? Excellent, Harriet Tubman. We just read about her, and Harriet Tubman's owner was not very nice to her. What did he do to her one time that we read about? That's right. He one time hit her so hard that she had sleeping spells. Carver was lucky that he was treated decently by his owners. George was not a strong boy. He wrote later that his body was in constant warfare between life and death. The carvers did not make him work hard on the farm. He fed the animals and helped Susan Carver around the house. He had plenty of time to swim and explore the nearby woods. George had his own little garden. He wrote later, "I wanted to know every strange stone, flower, insect, bird, or beast, and many are the tears I have shed because I would break the roots of a flower off of those pets." Pets is in quotes, like as if his flowers were pets. But he hid his garden in the brush because it was considered foolish in that neighborhood to waste time on flowers. The Carvers wanted him educated the same as white children. They taught him to read, spell, and write, just a little. George needed to know more. His only book was a Webster Elementary spelling book. He read it so often he knew it by heart, but the book had few answers for him. When George was 12, he went to a school for African American children in nearby Neosho. There he lived with Maria and Andrew Watkins, a black couple. He paid for his room and food by helping around the house. His aunt, Maria, not his real aunt, was a nurse. George learned from her which plants and herbs cure illnesses. She also taught him the value of time. Even during school recess, he had to run home to help Maria with the laundry. There was no time for play. The teacher in the Neosho school did not know much more than George. After less than a year there, George felt he needed to move on. He found a family on its way to Fort Scott, Kansas, almost 100 miles away, and he hitched a ride. In Fort Scott, George went to school, worked in a nearby grocery, and did laundry for people staying at the Wilder House, a hotel. He lived with a blacksmith and his family and helped out there too. In March 1879, in Fort Scott, a mob of masked white men pulled a black prisoner out of jail, tied him with a rope, and dragged him for 5 blocks. The prisoner was hanged and later burned. George Washington Carver witnessed that lynching and quickly left Fort Scott. The ugly memory of that night haunted George the rest of his life. Sarah, what do you think you would do if you were George Washington Carver at this point? You would give up and go home? I don't blame you. George Washington Carver, let's see what he did. He went to Olos, Kansas. From there he went to Piola, Kansas, and then to Minneapolis, Kansas, where he graduated from high school. Carver still had what he called the thirst for knowledge. In 1885, he applied by mail and was accepted to Highland University. But then, when he arrived to begin his studies, he was told that he could not attend the school because he was black. How do you think he felt about that? That's right, very hurt. Who can make a prediction about what will happen now in the story? Go ahead. You think George Washington Carver is going to give up? Well, let's see. George Washington Carver changed his plans. He became a farmer and bought land farther west. He built a one-room sod house with walls made of thick chunks of grassy dirt and a roof made of tar paper and dirt. He planted vegetables, studied art, and made friends. But he became restless. He still had a thirst to learn. Carver traveled east to Iowa, and in September 1890 he enrolled in Simpson College. He was the school's first African-American student. He studied art there, but soon realized he could do more for his people working with plants. He transferred to Iowa State College, where he studied agriculture. At Iowa State, Carver joined the Bating, German, and art clubs. He became a trainer for the school's football team and held prayer meetings. God and religion were always important to him. When he studied nature, he felt he was getting closer to God by learning more about his creation. George Washington Carver graduated from Iowa State in 1894 and became the school's first African-American teacher. He also continued his studies. By 1896, he had earned a Master of Science degree.